I'm Rachel Carter. 27 and 3 days ago, I buried the man who taught me how to balance a ledger and make a good life from honest work. Today, I'm sitting in a law office that smells like lemon polish and old paper while my heartbeat taps against the chair back like it wants out. Sunlight cuts through the blinds and stripes the conference table as if I'm already on trial. Arthur Lane reads numbers that sound like another language because none of them bring Tom back. My black dress still feels stiff at the collar where the seam scratches my neck. I nod, like I understand when he says sole beneficiary and majority stake. I keep both hands around the coffee cup so they won't shake, and then the door opens without a knock, and two faces from a life I no longer claim step into the room. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to stand steady when people who left you came back for what you built. I didn't grow up with much, but I grew up with people who believed in doing right by your word. Tom found me when I was 10 and the house had gone quiet. He drove me home, made soup in July, and told me that sleeping through the night was a skill you practice, not a gift you're given. May tucked my hair behind my ear and hummed old hymns while the laundry clicked in the next room, and somewhere between spelling tests and sweeping the porch after dinner, I learned that kindness is a habit you keep, even when no one says thank you. Harbor and Hearth started in our garage with a borrowed sander and a sketchbook, then stretched into a warehouse where sawdust sweetened the air. I filed invoices at 13 for $1 a stack, balanced petty cash at 16, and by 20, I was riding along to meet suppliers who shook Tom's hand as if the grip itself could guarantee integrity. We were not rich, not the way glossy magazines frame it, but I never felt poor. Our wealth was measured in people who came back because our tables didn't wobble in quiet Saturdays when the porch light glowed and the ledgers closed clean at the bottom line. Still, there was always another world, just across town, lake houses with long driveways, holiday parties where name tags did the work of introductions, women who wore cream sweaters you couldn't spill on, and men who said strategy when they meant pressure. When Harbor and Hearth moved into a proper showroom and I stood under the soft track lights beside a dining set Tom had designed, that other world finally turned its face our way. Tom taught me to pay attention to both sides of a receipt and every side of a person, to remember that a customer may be wrong about the price, but right about the feeling, and that fairness isn't charity, it's clarity you offer without being asked. Arthur's office was all polished mahogany and careful order, and for a while I let the order hold me up. He slid a folder toward me, speaking gently about inventory ratios and a transition plan, and I told myself I could be the kind of owner who keeps promises even when grief keeps tugging at the hem of your sleeve. I could picture Tom's watch on my wrist catching the light as I signed Payroll May at the kitchen window, counting the minutes on her second cup of coffee. The flagship store on Mercer humming in the late morning, while a young couple tested drawer pulls as if choosing a dresser could anchor a life. That's when the private world broke. No knock, no courtesy, just a door swinging wide, and my father's salesman smile walking in like he'd been invited. Bruce wore the same square jaw as the picture I stopped keeping, and a blue button-down that said he'd tried to be respectable. Lydia moved like a memory. I'd rather not keep perfume in a bottle that hadn't changed. "We're so sorry for your loss," he said, and the word loss fell between us like he'd set it down on the table for me to inventory. My hand found the edge of the folder, as if paper could steady Bone May's voice from 100 nights back, rose up in the quiet breathe in on 4, out on 5. And I did, because sometimes the only thing you can control is the count. Grief makes the air feel heavy, but clarity makes it sharp. And in that moment, both belonged to me. Arthur stood polite but firm, reminding them this was a confidential meeting, and I realized how precise their timing was, waiting until the obituary ink was barely dry, waiting until Tom wasn't here to step between us, waiting until beneficiary had a name they could press with a thumb. Bruce said, "Family like it was a key that still fit the lock." Lydia said, "Honey," like the word could turn back 16 years, and the room folded back on itself until I was 10, with a note on the kitchen counter and a quiet that taught me what absence sounds like. I kept my voice even because Tom valued even hands told them I needed time, and watched his eyes harden at the word boundary, even though I hadn't said it out loud. May appeared in the doorway with tissues and a posture that meant we were not alone. She moved to my side without hurry, and something inside me clicked into place. Our family, the real one, had always done its protecting in small, faithful ways that didn't make noise. There is a feeling you get when a storm is close but not yet here, when the light goes a little strange and the birds fall silent. As Bruce and Lydia stood there in Arthur's office, older and not a bit wiser, I understood that feeling down to the bone. They glanced at the folder with the company valuation like it was a menu, not a life's work, and I understood they had not come back to ask how I was managing the nights or whether May was sleeping through. "We'll be in touch," he said at last, like a man confirming a delivery window. And when they left the room, the quiet did not feel like peace. It felt like the space before a question. I walked out with May, our shoulders nearly touching the hallway, bright with noon light and floor wax, and I knew what Tom would have told me if he'd been there to say it out loud. There are some doors you close gently, and some you lock, because you intend to keep what's inside safe. At the curb, the city kept moving, and I kept counting my breath 4 and 5 out, already knowing the next knock would not be polite, and the next time they used the word family, they would put a price beside it. The house felt too still the morning they came again. 3 days had passed since that first ambush at Arthur's office, and I had spent every hour caught between exhaustion and alertness. Coffee brewed in the kitchen, the scent filling the air, but I barely tasted it. When the doorbell rang, I didn't need to check who it was. My chest tightened as I stood in the foyer, hand on the knob counting to 5 before pulling the door open. There they were, side by side, dressed as though appearance could disguise motive. My father's jaw carried the same firmness I'd seen in the mirror every morning. My mother's perfume drifted across the threshold, unchanged after all these years. I tried to block the doorway with my stance, telling them they couldn't just arrive unannounced. Bruce offered a smile, one I had seen him use on neighbors when pushing some half-baked venture, and asked for 5 minutes. Against Arthur's advice and against my own better judgment, I stepped aside and let them in. They walked through the rooms like strangers, cataloging an open-house eyes, pausing on the cabinets. Tom had renovated the appliances, he had splurged on the artwork we had chosen together. I led them to the kitchen table not out of hospitality, but because I needed a place to keep my hands still. "Black, no sugar," my father said when I asked about coffee. He answered as if he belonged here, as if we were simply continuing a routine we had never shared. My mother's voice was softer as she asked for cream, though I noticed her hands tremble as she reached for the mug. I leaned against the counter instead of sitting with them. The silence stretched, broken only by the clock ticking in the hallway. Then my father placed a leather folder on the table and slid it across the wood. Inside were spreadsheets, financial valuations, property assessments, all with my uncle's estate neatly dissected and labeled. He explained with practiced ease that they had researched Harbor and Hearth, the estate, and every asset connected to it. Their concern, he said, was to understand the full picture. The bluntness carried no warmth, only calculation. I asked where they had obtained the information, but he waved it off, insisting the details didn't matter. They mattered to me. My mother pulled out another folder from her bag, this one filled with court records, custody agreements, and financial notes. The figure that caught my eye, $13,500, froze me in place. She spoke of difficult times of debts and choices, but the truth was inked clearly across the page. They had sold me. For less than the cost of a used car, they had signed away their rights and left me behind. The floor beneath me seemed to shift as memories aligned Tom's guarded tone when speaking of them, his long sighs during holidays, the way he never explained why certain phone calls left him restless. He had not simply taken me in, he had bought my safety. I pushed the papers back toward them, my voice sharp when I told them exactly what they had done. My father's face tightened, but he didn't deny it. He simply leaned forward and said, they had problems now that debts were mounting and time was short. $85,000 owed to men who wouldn't wait, $45,000 in credit cards, medical bills stacked higher than their explanations. They spoke of urgency of needing help within weeks. Then came the threat, quiet but heavy. They would contest the will. They insisted they were still my parents, that legal details could be reinterpreted, that courts could be persuaded. My laugh was hollow as I reminded them of their signatures, the papers that proved otherwise. But their desperation carried danger. I saw it in the way my father's jaw set, in the way my mother's eyes darted not with regret, but calculation. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, and May stepped quietly into the room. She saw the folders, the tension in my posture, and knew. Her voice was firm when she told them it was enough for one day. My father dismissed her presence, calling her the help, but May didn't move. She had been my family for 16 years, and in that moment, her quiet stance was louder than any defense. My parents gathered their documents, sensing they'd pressed as far as they could for now. At the door, my father turned back, telling me to think about what they'd said. I didn't answer. When they were gone, May guided me to the couch and returned with tea in Tom's porcelain cups, the ones reserved for moments that mattered. I asked if she had heard everything. She nodded, reminding me that Tom had seen this day coming, that he had prepared for it. My phone rang on the coffee table. Arthur's name flashed across the screen. His voice was calm but urgent as he explained he had uncovered files Tom had kept separate records of my parents' attempts to contact him, documentation I had never seen. May took my hand as Arthur's words sank in. It became clear then that this fight wasn't beginning. It had been building for years. Tom had anticipated their return, and he had laid the groundwork for me to defend myself. I wasn't alone, and I wasn't unprepared. As May squeezed my hand, I felt the weight of what lay ahead, heavier than grief, sharper than shock. My parents had shown their hand, and their intentions were as plain as the ink on those old custody papers. The storm had only brushed the edges. The next wave was coming, and I would need to be ready when it broke. The house felt different after they left, as if their presence had shaken the walls. May stayed close that evening, moving about the kitchen, with quiet hands setting tea on the counter, as though it might anchor me. I couldn't settle anywhere. Each time headlights swept across the front windows, I stiffened, half expecting them to return. I slept in Tom's old study that night, the scent of cedar still clinging to his desk, his watch ticking softly from the drawer where I had placed it after the funeral. Morning came gray and restless. I brewed coffee, but it sat untouched while I stood at the window watching the driveway for signs of their car. The silence of the house carried weight. Every corner reminded me of Tom's Sunday afternoons, at the dining table, his voice carrying through the hall as he walked May through grocery lists, the sound of his shoes on the porch steps. With him gone, each memory pressed harder against the emptiness. Arthur called mid-morning. He wanted me at his office to review the files he'd discovered. I agreed, though my stomach churned at the thought. May drove us downtown, her steady presence as comforting as the scarf she had wrapped around her shoulders. She sat beside me in the waiting room while Arthur gathered the documents into neat stacks. His office, always orderly, now looked like a command post. "These are reports Tom kept separately," Arthur explained, pushing a folder across the desk. "Private investigator notes, recordings, transcripts. He prepared for the possibility of your parents resurfacing." His words carried no judgment, only fact, but they landed with the force of inevitability. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were photographs, my father lingering near the flagship store, my mother waiting outside Tom's office building. Each page carried dates, times, brief descriptions of their attempts to reach him. Arthur played an audio file. My father's voice filled the room, lower than I remembered, yet familiar enough to make my chest tighten. He was pressing Tom for money, threatening the business if demands weren't met. My hand trembled slightly as I adjusted the volume, listening for every detail. The sound of clinking glasses in the background muffled voices of strangers. They had cornered him somewhere public. He hadn't told me. He had shielded me from every attempt carrying the burden alone. Another folder revealed letters from my mother. Hospital bills, pleas for emergency funds, notes that claimed illness. Arthur tapped Tom's handwritten margin notes. He had these checked. No record of admissions, no treatments. All fabricated. I closed the folder, slowly feeling the edges dig into my palms. The evidence stacked against them was undeniable, and yet it wasn't relief I felt. It was the sharp edge of betrayal cutting fresh. That evening, back at the house, May prepared dinner, though neither of us had much appetite. I sat at the kitchen table where my parents had spread their folders, earlier the same table where Tom had taught me how to reconcile accounts and why honesty mattered more than convenience. My plate remained untouched as the clock in the hallway ticked on. The sound was steady, but my chest wasn't. Sleep came late, broken by the creak of floorboards and the echo of my father's threats replaying in my mind. By the third day, the fatigue showed. May placed her hand gently on my arm as I stared at the coffee machine, lost in thought. "You need rest," she whispered, her voice low. I nodded, but knew rest would not come easily. The silence between us said more than words. We both understood the truth. Their return was not a momentary disruption. It was the beginning of something calculated. The unease followed me everywhere. At the flagship store, employees greeted me with warmth, yet I caught myself scanning the parking lot, half expecting to see their car again. Even in familiar aisles where Tom's design stood proudly on display, I felt the intrusion of their presence. Customers noticed my distraction, asking if everything was all right. I smiled politely, but the weight inside me remained. Arthur called again, his tone firmer this time. "Rachel, this isn't about if they try something, it's when. Tom left you the tools, but you'll need to use them." His words lingered after I hung up. May brought me tea, her silver hair catching the evening light. "He believed in you," she said simply. And in that moment, I felt the gap between who I had been, Tom's niece, protected, and who I now needed to become. That night, I walked the halls of the house, pausing at the photographs on the walls. Tom shaking hands with builders, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, family dinners, where May sat beside me as though she belonged in every frame. The house no longer felt like refuge alone. It felt like a fortress I would have to defend. The realization sank in slowly, piece by piece, like bricks being laid. I pressed Tom's watch against my wrist, listening to the quiet tick. It no longer reminded me of loss alone. It marked time moving forward, a rhythm that demanded steadiness. My parents had returned with threats wrapped in paper and polite words, but the silence that followed their departure revealed more than noise ever could. They had chosen their path, and I knew the next step would not be hesitation. The nights grew heavier, but so did the resolve forming beneath them. I could no longer afford to remain the child waiting for safety to arrive. The burden was mine, now carried with Tom's foresight, May's loyalty, and Arthur's guidance. The fear lingered, but within it, something else began to take shape, a readiness I had not recognized before. The house was quiet again, but it was no longer fragile silence. It was the silence before a decision. And I understood that when they came again, and I knew they would, I would have to stand not as the grieving niece, but as the heir Tom had raised me to be. Arthur's office smelled faintly of old leather and lemon polish, the kind of scent that clung to a room where important decisions were made. His desk was covered in neat stacks of folders, each one labeled in Tom's familiar handwriting. My eyes lingered on the notes in the margins, the slant of his pen as familiar as his voice. Sitting there, I realized he hadn't just left me an inheritance. He had left me a shield. "These are private investigator reports," Arthur explained, sliding the first folder across the polished surface. I opened it carefully. Inside were photographs of my father standing near the Harbor and Hearth flagship store, his expression intent, as though measuring the building. Dates and times were written in crisp ink. The images spanned years, each one a record of their attempts to reinsert themselves into our lives. Another folder revealed transcripts of phone calls. My father's voice filled the room when Arthur pressed play on a recording. "Ben, you've got money tied up in that company. What's $50,000 to you?" The words were rough, delivered with a confidence that carried threat beneath it. My fingers pressed tightly against the edge of the table as I listened. Tom's notes in the margins identified the place a tavern he never visited, meaning they had followed him there. The next stack was filled with letters from my mother, all written in her looping cursive. Each one was a plea for money. Emergency surgeries, unpaid bills, threats of foreclosure. Arthur tapped Tom's annotations written in firm block letters. Verified, false, no record. My chest tightened as I flipped page after page, realizing how thoroughly Tom had investigated, how carefully he had protected me. Then Arthur placed one final document on the desk, a restraining order granted just 2 years earlier. The judge's words were blunt, repeated harassment, financial exploitation, deliberate, emotional manipulation. Tom had secured legal distance, building another barrier between them and me. Reading those words, I felt my grief shift. For days I had been drowning in memories, unable to find footing. Now something steadier formed beneath me. May sat quietly beside me, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes scanning the documents without surprise. She had known Tom's vigilance. She had lived beside it. When Arthur closed the final folder, he looked at me carefully. "Rachel, he prepared you for this. He wanted you to be ready." His voice carried no doubt, only certainty. I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle into place. That night at the house, I spread the documents across the dining table. The wood was worn from years of meals, but sturdy enough to hold the weight of every file. May set a pot of tea beside me and lit the lamp overhead. The papers glowed under the warm light, each one a piece of the foundation Tom had built. For the first time since his funeral, I didn't feel like I was slipping. I felt like I was standing. Sleep didn't come easily, but when it did, it was different. I dreamed of Tom's voice, reminding me that every challenge was solved with preparation. He had said it often during business lessons, never raising his tone, never rushing the words. I woke before sunrise with that steadiness still in my chest. By morning I had made a decision. I asked Arthur to meet again, but not at his office. I wanted the next conversation with my parents to take place on my terms. At the store I told him, they won't risk making a scene there, not in public. He hesitated, but when he saw the resolve in my expression, he agreed. 2 hours later, I stood in the center of Harbor & Hearth's showroom. The air smelled faintly of varnish and cedar. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, warming the polished oak dining tables and the soft fabric of sectional sofas. Employees moved quietly through the aisles, pretending to rearrange displays, but I knew they were watching. Their presence steadied me. The glass doors opened, and my parents walked in as if they owned the place. My father wore a charcoal suit that strained at the waist. My mother's dress was cream, chosen to soften her image. They approached with cautious confidence, but when I lifted a folder from my bag, their steps faltered. "I found the files," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the showroom. Every letter, every recording, every attempt to manipulate. Tom kept everything. My father's smile flickered, his eyes narrowing before he caught himself. My mother reached for words, saying they had changed, that desperate times had forced desperate actions. I pulled out a single photocopied check stub, the one that showed $1,300 to $500, the price they had taken to sign me away. "You didn't just leave me," I told them, holding the paper steady. "You sold me." The color drained from my mother's face. Customers browsing nearby stopped pretending not to listen. My father leaned closer, lowering his voice in warning, but I stepped back before he could touch my arm. "There's nothing to discuss," I continued, keeping my tone even. "The court records are clear. You have no claim here, not to me and not to this business." My mother's eyes glistened, but my father's expression hardened. "This isn't over, Rachel," he said, his voice sharp. "Yes, it is," I replied, gesturing toward the doors. "At least for today. You're not welcome here." They stood frozen for a moment, then turned and walked out under the weight of every gaze in the showroom. My chest heaved, though I kept my shoulders square until the doors closed behind them. Only then did I let out a slow breath. Paula, our store manager, stepped forward with a small smile. "Your uncle always said you were stronger than you believed." Employees nodded as they gathered near, quiet support offered in their presence. A middle-aged couple who had witnessed everything shook my hand. "That took courage," the woman said gently. Her words echoed long after they left. Outside, May was waiting by her car. When she saw me, she searched my face and I nodded. "They're gone," I told her. Relief softened her expression, and for the first time in days, her smile reached her eyes. As we drove home, the late afternoon light stretched across the streets, painting everything in shades of gold. My phone buzzed with a message from Arthur. "The court records are ironclad. You did well today." I leaned back in the seat, the folder still warm in my lap. For the first time since Tom's death, I felt not only grief, but also strength. Yet even as the quiet settled around me, I knew my father's words at the door were not empty. This wasn't over. It had only begun. The victory at the store carried me through a few restless nights. For the first time since Tom's funeral, I felt I had reclaimed a piece of my footing. But the feeling didn't last. 3 days later, May placed a certified letter on the kitchen counter. The envelope was heavy, the kind you don't open casually. My hands shook only once as I tore it open. Inside was a summons. My parents had filed to contest the will, claiming undue influence and questioning Tom's mental state when he named me sole heir. They had also requested a temporary injunction to freeze all assets, including Harbor and Hearth. The words blurred for a moment before settling into sharp focus. They weren't just after money. They were after everything. The phone rang before I could steady myself. Arthur's voice came through calm but brisk. "They filed with Judge Harmon," he said. "She's known for caution in estate cases. They planned this carefully." I pressed the papers flat on the counter, each line more deliberate than the last. "How much time do we have?" I asked. "The emergency hearing is Friday morning," Arthur replied. My heart sank. That gave us less than 2 days. By evening, the house no longer resembled home. The dining table was buried beneath legal briefs adoption records Tom had prepared years ago, but never filed transcripts of threatening phone calls and notarized medical evaluations affirming Tom's clarity in his final months. May moved between the rooms, quietly keeping tea warm and setting witness lists in neat piles. Paula arrived with binders of sales reports and employee statements praising my role in the business. Everyone took their place without needing to be asked. The hours stretched deep into the night. I studied every case Victor Hale had ever argued, underlining phrases in the margins until my vision blurred. I knew what he would try. He would frame me as unprepared, as too emotional to handle the business as a grieving woman clinging to something beyond her reach. I rehearsed answers in my head, steadying my tone, reminding myself of the facts Tom had left behind. The following morning, the first blow came not from the courthouse, but from the press. May opened the door to find a reporter standing on the porch, microphone in hand. "Miss Carter," she began, her tone polished. "Your parents say they're concerned about your ability to manage such a substantial business in the wake of your loss. Would you like to comment?" I closed the door without answering, but damage was already in motion. Text messages poured in. "Paula wrote from the Bellevue store reporters here asking employees about you. What should we say?" Another message from operations. "2 customers canceled large orders. They heard the company may be changing hands." I leaned against the doorframe, the noise of it all pressing in at once. My parents weren't just fighting in court. They were waging a campaign to dismantle Harbor and Hearth's reputation. That night, the kitchen felt more like a war room than a home. Arthur's paralegal delivered thick folders of exhibits, while May contacted Tom's doctors to confirm testimony. Paula coordinated employee statements, gathering letters that spoke of Tom's confidence in me. Every corner of the house was stacked with evidence, each page a brick in the wall we were building. I sat at the head of the table, Tom's watch warm against my wrist, and distributed assignments as though it were a board meeting. "Sarah will gather client testimonials," I said. "Paula focus on sales data from the last year. Arthur prepare exhibits showing Tom's consistent intent over time. May you handle the medical confirmations." No one argued. They simply nodded and began their work. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting. I was leading. Midnight came, but none of us stopped. The lamp on the table burned low, casting a golden glow over our papers. May slid a folder across to me, her handwriting careful and neat. "I kept track of visitors during Mr. Tom's illness," she said. "Cars that slowed near the house, calls that came late. You might need it." I opened the folder and saw her notes, each entry dated, each description precise. My chest tightened. They had been circling even while Tom was alive, waiting for their chance. Arthur's phone rang around 1 a.m. His expression darkened as he listened. When he hung up, he told us they had hired Victor Hale. The name carried weight. He was the same attorney who had sued Harbor and Hearth years earlier in a supplier dispute. He knew the company's structure, its vulnerabilities. My stomach dropped. "They've done their homework," I said quietly. Arthur shook his head. "Intelligence without integrity is still beatable." By sunrise, the papers on the table formed a map of our defense. Legal filings, sworn affidavits, financial records, and employee statements all aligned, all ready. May brewed fresh coffee while Arthur adjusted his glasses and reviewed the checklist one last time. "We've done everything possible," he said. "Now we present it." His voice carried steadiness, but the lines around his eyes betrayed the strain. The doorbell rang again, sharp against the morning quiet. Another delivery this time, the official notice. The hearing had been moved up. Instead of Friday, it would take place the next morning at 8. They had pushed to shorten our time. Arthur's voice hardened as he read the notice. "They want to catch us unprepared." May tightened her scarf around her shoulders and met my eyes. "Then we work until dawn," she said simply. And we did. We sat shoulder to shoulder through the night, shuffling papers, rehearsing testimony, marking every page with yellow tabs. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed each passing hour, reminding us of the time slipping away. At one point, I stepped into Tom's study and stood before his portrait. His eyes, kind and steady, seemed to look straight through me. I whispered softly, promising him I would not let them dismantle what he had built. I would protect the business, the people, and the home he had entrusted to me. When dawn broke, pale light spilled through the windows. May set a hand on my shoulder as I gathered the files into a leather portfolio. "You're ready," she said. I nodded, though the weight in my chest made it hard to breathe. The courthouse waited. My parents would be there, polished and poised with their attorney at their side. But I would not walk in as the abandoned child they once left behind. I would walk in as Tom's heir, prepared for battle, with every truth he had documented, ready to stand on my behalf. And as we stepped into the morning air, the city waking around us, I knew this fight was no longer about grief alone. It was about survival. The courthouse smelled faintly of floor polish and paper as we took our seats at the front table. My blazer felt stiff across my shoulders, the fabric chosen as armor more than comfort. May sat beside me, her handkerchief folded neatly between her fingers, the embroidered corner brushing her thumb in a nervous rhythm. Across the aisle, my parents leaned close to their attorney, Victor Hale, their postures polished for the room. Bruce wore a suit, tailored within an inch of respectability. Lydia's hair swept back into a careful bun. They looked like parents offering concern, not the strangers who had abandoned me. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the room shifted as Judge Miriam Blake entered. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen every kind of dispute. Her silver hair was pulled back tightly, her glasses perched low on her nose as she scanned the case file in front of her. We sat again when she motioned, and my pulse thudded in my ears. Victor rose first, his voice smooth and deliberate. "Your Honor, my clients, Bruce and Lydia Carter, wish to express deep concern over the estate of the late Thomas Ellison. They worry their daughter, Miss Carter, may have exerted undue influence during his declining health." He referenced cardiac events Tom had suffered, speaking as though vulnerability equaled confusion. The accusation was spoken plainly, but it landed like a stone in the pit of my stomach. Bruce leaned forward, his hands clasped as though in prayer. "We only want what's best for our daughter and for Tom's legacy," he said, his tone carefully measured. Lydia nodded beside him, her eyes lowered as if grief weighed on her. Their act was precise, rehearsed. Judge Blake turned her gaze toward Arthur. "Mr. Lane, your response." Arthur rose slowly, adjusting his glasses before lifting a thick binder from our table. His voice was steady, carrying the weight of decades of practice. "Your Honor, this is not a case of undue influence. This is a case of calculated harassment, timed with the loss of the one man who stood between my client and her estranged parents." He opened the binder, sliding a document toward the clerk. "These are notarized records from 2009, where Bruce and Lydia Carter legally signed away parental rights for the sum of $13,500. The words echoed through the room. Whispers stirred in the gallery. I kept my eyes forward, but out of the corner of my vision, I saw Lydia's hand tighten on her purse strap. Arthur continued, his voice never raising, but cutting sharper with each word. "In addition, Your Honor, Benjamin Ellison, known to his family as Tom, maintained consistent estate planning for over 15 years. His will remained unchanged, naming Rachel Carter as his heir, long before his health declined. We have medical evaluations confirming his clarity through his final months. He gestured for the clerk to admit the documents into evidence. Victor shifted, his polished smile thinning at the edges. "Mistakes were made in the past," he said quickly, "but people grow. Their concern now is genuine. They only wish to ensure the company remains stable." Arthur didn't look away. "Your Honor, we also have court filings documenting a restraining order Tom Ellison secured against them in 2021. The judge in that case cited repeated financial exploitation and deliberate emotional manipulation. He placed the order before Judge Blake. The weight of it hung in the room. The judge leaned forward, scanning the papers. "Mr. Hale, were you aware of this?" she asked. Victor hesitated, the briefest crack in his confidence. "I was aware there were prior disputes," he replied, his voice lower. Arthur wasn't finished. He signaled to the clerk, who pressed play on a small speaker. My father's voice filled the courtroom, unmistakable, even through static. "Ben, you've got $15 million tied up in that business. What's $50,000 to you? If you don't help out, I'll have to consider other options. Would be a shame if something disrupted Rachel's work there." The sound silenced the room. Lydia's face went pale. Bruce stared straight ahead, his jaw set tight, his expression carved in stone. Judge Blake's brow furrowed as she made notes on her pad. Arthur closed his binder with calm finality. Tom Ellison documented every contact because he knew this day might come. His foresight leaves no question of intent. May rose when called to testify. She stood straight, though her hands trembled slightly as she swore her oath. "I worked in Mr. Ellison's household for 16 years, she said, her voice steadying as she went on. "I helped raise Rachel after her parents left, and I can tell you, Your Honor, Tom was sharp until the day he passed. He ran that business every week, reviewed finances with Rachel every Friday, and planned the spring collection right before his death." Her words carried no embellishment, only truth. 3 store managers followed, each describing Tom's clarity. His pride in my role, his repeated statements that Harbor and Hearth belonged to me when his time came. Paula testified that Tom would point out my design choices to customers, boasting that I had the eye for what families wanted in their homes. Their voices, steady and consistent, built the picture Arthur wanted the court to see. When testimony ended, Judge Blake set her glasses down and looked across the room. "I have seen enough to decide the emergency petition." She paused, letting silence settle before continuing. "The request for injunctive relief is denied. The estate remains with Rachel Carter as the lawful heir." Relief rushed through me, but I kept still, holding May's hand under the table. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, the will contains a no-contest clause enforceable under state law. By filing this petition, the Carters have forfeited any potential claim they might have had. A ripple of sound moved through the gallery. My father's face flushed crimson, a vein tightening at his temple. Judge Blake tapped her gavel lightly. "I also order the petitioners to pay all legal costs associated with this hearing, and given the documented history of harassment, I am granting a restraining order prohibiting Bruce and Lydia Carter from coming within 1,000 feet of Rachel Carter, her residence, or any Harbor and Hearth property." Her gaze sharpened. "Any violation will result in contempt charges." Victor placed a hand on my father's arm before he could rise. My mother lowered her head, her expression unreadable. The gavel struck once more. "This case is dismissed." As we gathered our papers, I felt the tightness in my chest ease for the first time in weeks. May dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. Arthur leaned close. "It's over. They have no more recourse." Outside, sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps. Employees from Harbor and Hearth had gathered, their faces bright with relief. A small cheer rose as May linked her arm through mine. I touched Tom's watch on my wrist, its steady tick anchoring me. I wasn't the child they had abandoned anymore. I wasn't just the grieving niece. I was the guardian of Tom's legacy, and for the first time I felt the strength of it fully. But even in that moment of victory, I knew life rarely closes its doors so neatly. My parents had left defeated, yet the echo of their determination lingered. And deep inside, I understood that though I had won this battle, the story of what came next was still waiting to be written. The air outside the courthouse was crisp sunlight spreading across the stone steps as we walked out. I could hear the murmur of employees gathered nearby. their faces breaking into cautious smiles when they saw Arthur give me a small nod. May linked her arm through mine, her steps lighter than I had seen in weeks. The decision had been clear. The weight I had carried was shifting, not gone, but finally lifting. Inside Harbor and Hearth the next morning, the atmosphere was different. Customers moved through the aisles as usual, but the employees carried themselves taller, their glances toward me filled with quiet reassurance. Paula gathered the team in the break room and spoke plainly. "Mr. Ellison built this place with honesty," she said, "and Rachel stood for that yesterday." Applause followed, not loud but steady, each clap a note of loyalty that reached me deeper than words. By afternoon, reporters called for statements. Arthur advised caution, but I agreed to one interview with a local paper that had always covered Tom with fairness. We sat in the store's showroom sunlight, touching the polished wood of a dining table Tom designed himself. The reporter asked why I had chosen to fight. I answered carefully, telling her it wasn't about fortune, but about honoring the man who raised me and protecting the employees who depended on the company. The article ran 2 days later with the headline, "Heir Defends Family Legacy Against Legal Assault." The ripple was immediate. Customers who had canceled orders returned. Messages poured in from longtime clients offering support. One even wrote, "We bought our first dining set here 20 years ago. We'll be back for our granddaughters." Reading those words, I realized Harbor and Hearth wasn't just furniture. It was part of people's homes, stitched into their stories, the way it was into mine. May suggested we mark the moment with something Tom would have wanted. That evening, employees, friends, and suppliers gathered in the flagship store. We didn't host a banquet or give speeches. We simply unlocked the doors, set out coffee and pie, and let people wander through the aisles sharing stories of Tom. A retired carpenter leaned against one of the counters, remembering how Tom once drove 2 hours to deliver a custom piece because a customer's truck had broken down. A young couple spoke of choosing their first sofa here, still stained from the night they brought their newborn home. I stood near the front window listening. Every story added another layer to who Tom had been, not just my uncle, but a man who had poured kindness into a business until it became something greater. When May took the microphone, her voice wavered but never broke. "Tom believed in building things that lasted," she said, "and he believed Rachel was the one to carry that forward." The applause that followed wasn't for me alone. It was for every hand that had worked beside him, for every life his work had touched. Later that night, Arthur brought out one final envelope Tom had left behind. It was smaller than the rest, tucked into the back of the files. Inside was a letter written in his neat, familiar script. "Rachel," it began. "If you're reading this, it means the fight I hoped you'd never face has come. Remember, you are not alone. May is with you. Arthur will guide you. The business is built to stand. Trust yourself the way I trusted you." My eyes blurred as I folded the paper, the steady rhythm of his words anchoring me once again. The following week, we launched the Benjamin Ellison Foundation, a project Tom had drafted but never announced. Its purpose was simple: to provide small business grants for craftsmen and apprentices who wanted to build honest work with their hands. The board included Arthur, May, Paula, and 2 longtime suppliers who had known Tom from the beginning. We held the first meeting in the same garage where Harbor and Hearth had started, the smell of sawdust still lingering in the corners. The announcement spread quickly. Applications arrived from across the state. Woodworkers, metalworkers, ceramicists, all carrying stories of struggle and determination. Reading them, I felt Tom's presence again, his belief that hard work deserved a chance. For every check we signed, I imagined his hand steadying mine. One evening, May and I walked the quiet halls of the house. She paused at Tom's portrait, her eyes soft. "He'd be proud," she said, adjusting the frame slightly. I nodded the letter from his envelope folded carefully in my desk upstairs. The silence around us was no longer heavy. It was full, holding space for everything we had fought to protect. Yet even in the warmth of victory, the edges of unease lingered. My parents had left the courtroom stripped of their claim, but I knew them well enough to sense their resentment had not disappeared. They had lost the legal battle, but bitterness has a way of waiting in shadows. I carried that thought with me, even as Harbor and Hearth thrived, even as the foundation took root. One evening, as I locked the showroom, I caught sight of a car idling across the street. The headlights dimmed before it pulled away. I told myself it was nothing but the memory of my father's voice on that recording reminded me otherwise. I slid Tom's watch higher on my wrist, its steady tick, a reminder that time moves forward no matter what lingers behind. The foundation was alive, the company secure, and the family I had chosen stood beside me. But I understood the story wasn't finished. The past had a way of circling back, and though the courts had spoken, I knew there was still one chapter left to write. The weeks after the courthouse decision were strangely quiet. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for a phone call, a letter, or another ambush. Harbor and Hearth thrived again. The foundation launched smoothly, and the people around me carried themselves with a steadiness that made the air feel lighter. Yet sometimes at night, when the house was still, I would catch myself listening for the sound of a car slowing outside. The fear didn't last long. It never rooted itself again, but it reminded me that scars don't vanish overnight. One evening I stood on the porch, Tom's watch warm against my wrist, and watched the garden May had tended for years. She had planted new rose bushes that spring their first buds reaching for the light. She joined me with 2 mugs of tea, setting one on the railing. "He'd be proud of you, Rachel," she said, her voice calm, not just for winning, but for carrying on. I held her gaze, knowing she was right. The fight had ended, but the real work, the living, the leading, the choosing of what kind of family we wanted to be, was just beginning. A few days later, Paula gathered the staff for a short meeting in the showroom. She presented the first scholarship check from the foundation to a young carpenter named Daniel. His hands shook as he accepted it, his eyes wide with gratitude. Watching him, I thought of the garage where Tom had started all of this, and how proud he would have been to see someone new given the same chance he once had. It wasn't just about money, it was about dignity, the belief that people deserved a fair shot if they were willing to work. Arthur came by that afternoon carrying another folder, though this time it wasn't filled with court documents or depositions. Instead, it held the finalized paperwork for the foundation properly registered and fully funded. He placed it in my hands with a small smile. "This is what victory looks like," he said, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe it. That night, I sat at Tom's old desk in the study papers, neatly stacked, the lamp casting its soft glow across the wood. I thought back to the girl I had been at 10 years old, waiting for parents who never returned. For so long, I believed abandonment defined me. But the truth was different. What defined me were the people who showed up every day: May with her steady hands, Tom with his endless patience, Arthur with his quiet counsel, Paula with her loyalty. That was family. That was legacy. A week later, I visited the workshop behind the flagship store. The smell of sawdust filled the air as apprentices worked on new pieces, their concentration deep, their laughter echoing. When one made a mistake and another teased him gently, I leaned against the doorway, letting it all wash over me. This was what Tom had built, and this was what I would carry forward, not just furniture, but a community, a promise that even after loss, there is room for rebuilding. I no longer worried about Bruce and Lydia. Whatever bitterness they carried, it was no longer mine to hold. The restraining order made their distance legal, but my own heart made it final. I chose not to spend another ounce of my life chasing people who had walked away so easily. Instead, I poured myself into those who stayed, who showed loyalty not out of obligation, but out of love. As summer gave way to fall, May and I hosted a small gathering at the estate. Employees, neighbors, and foundation recipients filled the rooms. The laughter was real, the warmth undeniable. I stood near the fireplace, Tom's portrait above the mantel, and spoke simply. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who stand beside you when it matters most. That's the legacy Tom left us. That's what I hope we'll keep building together. Applause rose softly, not like a performance, but like an embrace. May's eyes glistened. Arthur nodded. Paula smiled, and I felt it. A circle closed, a weight lifted, a future ready to begin. When the evening ended and the last guest left, I stepped outside once more. The night was cool, the garden quiet, the roses blooming even in the dim light. I touched Tom's watch, steady against my wrist, and whispered a thank you into the darkness. Not for the inheritance, not even for the protection, but for the love that had made me whole. Life doesn't always give us the family we expect. Sometimes it gives us harder lessons and heavier burdens. But it also gives us choices about who we trust, who we fight for, and who we allow to walk beside us. Justice isn't always found in a courtroom. Sometimes it's found in the quiet moments afterward, when you finally realize you're free to choose love over fear, loyalty over betrayal, and hope over loss. And that's what I carry with me now. Not the memory of being abandoned, but the certainty that I was never truly alone. I was chosen, I was loved, and I was prepared for this life. Thank you for listening to my story. If it spoke to you in some way, I'd love for you to share where you're from in the comments and maybe subscribe so we can walk through more stories together.